The smell of grilled ribeye filled my backyard as my family gathered for our Sunday barbecue, a tradition my late wife started over 30 years ago. I had just picked up my fork when my son-in-law smirked, swept his arm across the table, and sent my steak crashing onto the patio. "At your age, old man, you don't need steak." Everyone froze. I calmly picked up his luxury SUV key, walked to the pond, and dropped it in. "It's only a car key. Before we go further, thank you for being here. It means more than you know. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your city, your state, your country. I'd love to know who's in this with me." Some names and places in this story have been changed, but the lesson it carries that's worth every minute of your time. The smell hit me the moment I stepped outside, charcoal smoke, hickory wood, and the faint sweetness of brown sugar from the dry rub I'd been mixing since 9 that morning. 43 years of Sunday afternoons had trained my nose to recognize that smell the way some men recognize the sound of a church bell. It meant one thing: family was coming. I'm Frank Callahan, 63 years old. Retired welder, 35 years, at a structural steel plant outside Franklin, Tennessee. My knees sound like gravel in a tin can. When I climb stairs, my lower back starts complaining around 2 in the afternoon, and I've got a hearing aid in my left ear that whistles when the humidity gets above 70%. None of that matters much on Sundays. Sundays belong to Ruth. My wife started this tradition 30 years ago, back when Diane was barely old enough to reach the picnic table without standing on her toes. Ruth truly believed the way she believed in morning coffee and public school teachers, that a family that eats together stays together. She'd spend all of Saturday marinating the meat, ironing the tablecloth, calling relatives she hadn't spoken to in weeks, just to make sure they knew they had a seat waiting. Ruth passed 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the last morning I held her hand in our bedroom. But the Sundays didn't stop. I wouldn't let them. Every week I pull out the index card she kept taped inside the spice cabinet. Her handwriting faded blue ink corners soft from years of being handled, and I follow it exactly. Garlic powder first, then smoked paprika, coarse black pepper, a pinch of brown sugar last, because Ruth said the sugar was the secret nobody ever guessed. That Sunday, the 3rd week of June, I had 4 ribeyes resting under foil and the baked potatoes wrapped in aluminum foil sitting on the upper rack. The backyard looked the way Ruth always wanted it to look, the old oak throwing shade across the lawn, the garden hose coiled neat beside the spigot, and the long wooden picnic table she'd picked out herself at a furniture barn in Brentwood back in 1994. She'd walked around that table 3 times before she decided. "It needs to be big enough for everyone, Frank," she'd said. "Even the ones we haven't met yet." Walter Gaines from next door arrived first the way he always did, carrying a 6-pack of Coors and wearing the same faded Nashville Predators cap he'd worn to every barbecue since 2009. Walter was 68, a retired electrician, and had been my neighbor for 22 years. He'd been at Ruth's funeral. He'd been at my kitchen table the week after talking about nothing in particular for 3 hours because he understood that sometimes a man just needs another voice in the room. "Smells like a Sunday," Walter said, dropping into his usual chair at the end of the table. "Always does," I said. Diane arrived 20 minutes later with a bowl of potato salad covered in plastic wrap. Her dark hair pulled back, wearing her nursing scrubs because she'd come straight from a half-shift at Williamson Medical. My daughter. 36 years old, smart as a whip with Ruth's eyes and her mother's habit of talking with her hands when she got excited. Behind her came Ryan. Ryan Porter was 39, tall, square-jawed, with the kind of easy smile that real estate school must teach somewhere between contract law and commission structures. He sold luxury homes in the Brentwood and Franklin corridor, the kind of houses with three-car garages and wine cellars that people who grew up in houses like mine spent their whole careers building. He was dressed in pressed khakis and a collared shirt on a Sunday afternoon, which told you something about him right there. He shook my hand the way men do when they want you to notice the firmness of their grip. "Frank," he said, "smells incredible out here." "Help yourself to a drink," I said. The afternoon moved the way good summer afternoons do, slow and easy, full of small talk, and the sound of the Cardinals game drifting out from the garage radio. Walter argued with my nephew Kevin about truck engines. Diane told a story about a kid at the hospital who'd swallowed a Lego brick and the look on the parents' faces when the X-ray came back. I laughed until my eyes watered. Then Ryan set his glass down and looked at my plate. I'd just cut into the first ribeye, cooked exactly the way Ruth liked it, medium with a dark crust, when Ryan leaned back in his chair and said loud enough for the whole table to hear, "That's a pretty serious steak for a man your age, Frank." I looked up. He was smiling, but his eyes weren't. "I earned it," I said. Sure. He reached across the table, I thought, for the barbecue sauce, and his forearms swept clean across my plate. The ribeye, the baked potato, the corn on the cob, everything went over the edge and hit the stone patio with a crack that stopped every conversation at once. Ryan glanced down at the mess on the ground. Then he shrugged, picked up his burger and said, "At your age, skipping the red meat isn't the worst idea in the world." Nobody laughed. Not Walter, not Kevin, not Diane. I sat there for a moment, hands flat on the table, feeling the heat rise up through my chest into my throat. 63 years old, and the first instinct my body had was to apologize. Isn't that something? Another man humiliates you in your own backyard, and your gut reaction is to smooth it over so nobody feels uncomfortable. Ruth would have hated that about me. I looked at the mess on the patio, 3 hours of preparation on the ground, Ruth's dry rub soaking into the concrete, and then I looked at the table. Ryan's key fob was sitting right next to his glass. Black leather BMW logo. The SUV he'd parked in my driveway was worth more than I'd made in 3 years at the plant. I picked up the key fob. Ryan frowned. "Frank, what are you?" I walked to the edge of the pool. 8 feet of water, still and blue in the late afternoon sun. I held the key fob over the surface for exactly 1 second. Then I let it go. It hit the water with a clean, quiet splash and disappeared. I turned around. "It's just a car key." Ryan's face went the color of raw dough. He shot up from his chair so fast it scraped back across the stone. "Are you out of your mind?" "Probably not," I said. Diane was on her feet, her potato salad spoon still in her hand, staring at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was 16, and I'd told her she couldn't go to a concert in Nashville on a school night. Not concern. Not worry about her father. Something closer to embarrassment. "Dad," she said. And the way she said it, tight controlled like she was already doing damage assessment, told me everything I needed to know about which direction this was going to go. Ryan was pacing along the edge of the pool, staring into the water, pressing both hands against the sides of his head. "Do you know what that key costs to replace?" "That's a BMW, Frank. It's not a car key," Walter said from the end of the table very calmly. "That's what Frank said." Ryan pointed at him. "You stay out of this." "I'm just agreeing with the man," Walter said, and took a long sip of his Coors. I walked back to my chair, sat down, and looked at my empty plate. The afternoon had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. It was the quiet of a room where everyone is waiting for someone else to say the thing nobody wants to say. Diane was still staring at me. Her eyes were bright, her jaw set, and in all the noise of Ryan pacing and my nephew pretending to study the grass, and Walter examining his beer can like it held the answers to the universe. I realized that my daughter hadn't once asked whether I was okay. Not once. The last guest pulled out of my driveway a little after 7. I stood on the back porch and listened to the neighborhood settle into evening. A lawnmower 2 streets over, the Murphy kids down the block shooting hoops in their driveway. A mockingbird somewhere in the oak tree doing its best impression of a car alarm. Franklin, Tennessee on a Sunday night sounds like the world is trying very hard to convince you everything is fine. I went inside and started cleaning up. There's a rhythm to cleaning up after a barbecue that I've always found steadying. Stack the plates. Wrap the leftover potato salad. Scrub the grill grates while they're still warm enough to loosen the char. Ruth used to stand beside me at the sink, drying whatever I washed, talking about the afternoon, who said what, who seemed tired, whether my brother Dennis was finally going to fix that rattling exhaust on his pickup. I could still feel the absence of her beside me at the sink, the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue. Constant. Specific. I was rinsing the last serving tray when my phone rang. Diane. I dried my hands on the dish towel, the one with little roosters on it that Ruth bought at a craft fair in Leiper's Fork, and answered. Hey, sweetheart. Dad. Her voice was controlled, measured. Nurse voice. The one she used when she didn't want a patient to see her worried. I need to ask you something. Go ahead. The key fob. A short pause. Do you have any idea what that's going to cost to replace? I set the dish towel on the counter. Outside, the mockingbird switched from car alarm to something that sounded almost like a song. I imagine it'll cost what it costs, I said. Dad, those BMW key fobs are programmed to the specific vehicle. It's not like going to the hardware store and getting a spare cut. Ryan already called the dealership. They're talking about $450 minimum. Diane, I said. He knocked my dinner onto the ground. I know what happened. In front of everyone. Dad, I know. Her voice tightened at the edges. But you throwing his key into the pool, doesn't it? Doesn't make things better. It just makes everything more complicated. I pulled out the kitchen chair at the end of the table, my chair, the one with the slightly uneven leg that Ruth kept meaning to fix and never got around to, and sat down. Across the table, Ruth's chair was empty. Same blue cushion she'd picked out at Target 6 years ago. Same small scratch on the front leg where Diane had dragged it across the floor when she was 8 years old, trying to reach something on the counter. Sweetheart, I said. You called me. Right now, tonight, after what happened, and your first question was about the key fob. The line went quiet enough that I could hear her breathing. I'm asking because Ryan is upset, she said finally. Ryan knocked my food on the ground and told me I was too old to eat steak, I said. In my backyard, at a table your mother picked out 30 years ago. In front of Walter and Kevin and everyone else who came here today. I kept my voice even, not angry, just clear. I'm not asking you to choose sides, Diane. I'm just telling you what happened. Oh, I know what happened, she said. And now there was something strained pulling at the edges of her voice, something that sounded less like anger and more like the specific exhaustion of a woman who had been holding two things together for a long time and was starting to feel the weight. I was there, Dad. Then you know he didn't say sorry. Another pause. Longer this time. He'll come around, she said. He just needs some time. Okay, I said. So you'll think about the key fob. I looked across the table at Ruth's empty chair. At the scratch on the leg, at the blue cushion that had faded a little on the left side from years of afternoon sunlight coming through the window. "I'll think about it," I said. We said goodnight. I sat at the table for a long while after I put the phone down in the particular quiet of a house where someone used to be and isn't anymore. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the stove ticked. Outside, the mockingbird had finally gone silent. Ruth used to say that you could learn everything you needed to know about a person's priorities by watching what they did in the first 5 minutes after a crisis. Not what they said. What they did. Diane's first call had been to me. Her first question had been about a car key. I got up, walked to the spice cabinet, and opened it. Ruth's index card was still taped to the inside of the door. The blue ink faded to gray in places, the edges of the card soft and slightly curled. Garlic powder first. Smoked paprika. Coarse black pepper. A pinch of brown sugar last, because the sugar is the secret nobody ever guesses. I stood there reading it for longer than made any sense. Then I closed the cabinet, turned off the kitchen light, and walked to the window that looked out over the backyard. The pool was dark now, just a black rectangle catching the last bit of sky. Somewhere at the bottom of it, 8 feet down, was a BMW key fob worth $450. I stood there looking at the water, and for the first time that evening, I let myself think the thought I'd been pushing away since Ryan shrugged at my ruined dinner and reached for his burger. He hadn't knocked that plate by accident. 2 weeks passed. They passed the way uncomfortable weeks do when you're 63 and retired and living alone in a house full of quiet, slowly in the mornings, faster in the afternoons, and then all at once gone when you look up and realize it's Sunday again, and nobody's called. Diane texted twice, both times about Ryan, how he was still upset, how the dealership had confirmed the replacement cost, how she hoped I was thinking about what I'd said I'd think about. I was thinking about other things. The first visit came on a Tuesday afternoon, 11 days after the barbecue. I was in the garage doing an oil change on my F-150 when Ryan's Mercedes pulled into the driveway. He climbed out alone, no jacket sleeves rolled to the elbows, hands in his pockets. The relaxed version of Ryan. The one he brought out when he wanted something. Frank. He crouched down beside the truck, looked at the oil pan like a man pretending to be interested in mechanical things. "How you holding up?" "Truck's running fine," I said, not looking up from the drain plug. He laughed like I'd made a joke. "Listen, I wanted to come by. Clear the air a little." He paused. "I think things got out of hand the other week." "Things got knocked off a plate," I said. His jaw tightened slightly, but the smile stayed put. "Fair enough." He stood, looked around the garage at the tools on the pegboard, the old license plates on the wall, the framed photo of me and Ruth at our 25th anniversary, still sitting on the corner of the workbench. His eyes moved across it all the way a man's eyes move across a room when he's calculating square footage. "You know," he said, "the market in Franklin right now is genuinely insane. Houses in this neighborhood are going for numbers that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago." I pulled the oil drain plug free and let the old oil run into the catch pan. Black and slow the way oil gets after 6,000 miles. "Is that right?" I said. "House 3 streets over, similar footprint to yours, sold in 4 days last month. Went for $910,000. He said the number the way real estate people say numbers, carefully watching your face. "Cash offer. Buyers didn't even ask for an inspection." "Good for them," I said. "To Frank." He crouched back down so we were at eye level, which I recognized as a sales technique. Get on the customer's level. Make it feel like a conversation between equals. "I'm just saying you're sitting on a significant asset here. You've got equity that most people your age would..." Ryan, I said. I set the wrench down and looked at him directly for the first time since he'd pulled into the driveway. I built this garage with my own hands in 2004. I poured that concrete slab out there on a Saturday in August, 102 degrees, because the contractor quoted me 4 times what the materials cost. This house isn't an asset. It's where I live. He held my gaze for a moment, then looked away first. I understand that, he said. I'm just thinking about your future. I'll let you know when I need help thinking about my future, I said. I picked up the wrench and went back to work. He left 5 minutes later. The second visit came 4 days after that, a Saturday morning, and this time Diane was with him. She brought coffee, the good stuff from the place in downtown Franklin she knew I liked, and she hugged me at the door and said she'd missed me, which made my chest ache because I believed her. Ryan stood just behind her shoulder, smiling with all his teeth. We sat on the back porch. The coffee was good. The conversation started easy. Diane talked about a patient, a 7-year-old boy named Marcus, who had been in the pediatric ward for 6 weeks and had finally gone home the previous Thursday. Her face when she talked about that boy looked exactly like Ruth's face used to look when something genuinely good happened in the world. Then Ryan set his cup down. You know, Diane and I have been talking, he said. About the future, long-term planning, that kind of thing. That's smart, I said. We've been looking at some options. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, turned it to face me. A website, clean, professional photographs of bright hallways and smiling older people, and a dining room that looked like a hotel restaurant. There's a place in Nashville over in Green Hills. It's not what you picture when you think, Ryan, I said. Just hear me out, Frank. I'm not moving to Nashville, I said. Diane leaned forward, and I could see it cost her something to do it. Her hands were wrapped around her coffee cup too tight. Dad, we're not saying you have to do anything. We're just saying that this house it's a lot for one person. The yard alone. I like the yard, I said. The maintenance. Keeps me busy, I said. She looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at her. That particular married couple exchange that happens in less than a second and contains an entire conversation. I watched it happen and felt something shift in my stomach. Daddy! She switched to the word she only used when she was really reaching for something, the Vietnamese word for father that Ruth had taught her as a small joke between them. It landed differently now. We love you. We just want what's best for you. I know you do, I said, and I meant it. God help me, I meant every word of it, because whatever else was happening, she was still my daughter, and she still looked like Ruth when she was worried. But I also knew that Ryan Porter had been in my garage 2 weeks ago, calculating square footage, and had now shown up with brochures for a retirement community in Nashville, and these two things did not feel like coincidences. I drove them out after lunch. Stood on the porch watching Ryan's Mercedes back down the driveway, Diane's hand visible through the passenger window, raised in a small wave that felt like it was asking for something I didn't know how to give yet. Back inside, I sat at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee and my thoughts. The house was quiet. The afternoon light came through the window the same way it had come through that window for 33 years. I thought about what Ryan had said both times. The market, the equity, long-term planning. I thought about the way his eyes had moved around my garage, and I thought about a third visit, about a week from now, when Diane had mentioned offhand, casually, like an afterthought, that Ryan was bringing someone by to quote some minor exterior repairs. A quote on repairs I hadn't asked for from someone I hadn't contacted, arranged by a man who had twice in 2 weeks found reasons to talk about what my house was worth. I got up, walked to the window, and looked out at the backyard. The wooden picnic table sat in the same spot it had sat for 30 years. The pool caught the afternoon light. The oak tree Ruth had loved threw its shade across the lawn. Something was wrong. I didn't have proof yet. But in 35 years of working with steel, you learn to feel a crack before you can see one. The Saturday morning Walter Gaines knocked on my back door. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and Ruth's recipe box open in front of me. I don't know why I'd pulled it out. I hadn't been planning to cook anything special. Sometimes I just open it and sit there looking at her handwriting on the index cards, the way she wrote her lowercase g's with a little loop at the bottom, the way she underlined ingredients she considered non-negotiable. It's not a rational thing to do. But grief rarely is. Walter let himself in the way he always did, knocking twice and opening the door before I could answer. He had his coffee thermos in one hand and his predator's cap in the other, turning it by the brim the way he did when he had something on his mind he wasn't sure how to say. "You got a minute?" he asked. "I've got the whole morning," I said. "Sit down." He sat across from me, set his thermos on the table, and looked at Ruth's recipe box for a moment, without saying anything about it. That was one of the things I'd always appreciated about Walter. He didn't fill silences with noise just to fill them. "I've been going back and forth about telling you something," he said. "Been sitting on it for a few weeks now, and I finally decided that sitting on it any longer wasn't doing you any favors." I closed the recipe box. "Tell me." Walter turned his cap in his hands once more, then set it flat on the table. "About a month ago, this would have been mid-June, maybe a week or so before that Sunday, I was out front trimming the hedge along the property line. You know how that privet gets if you let it go more than a few weeks." "I know," I said. "Ryan pulled up," Walter said. "In that Mercedes of his. He had somebody with him, younger guy, maybe early 30s, dressed like he was headed to a listing appointment. Dark suit leather portfolio under his arm." Walter paused. "They walked the perimeter of your property, Frank. The whole thing. Front yard, side yard, came around to the back along the fence line. The younger guy was taking notes on his phone. Ryan was pointing things out the roofline, the lot size, the pool. I felt something go very still in my chest. I figured maybe he was getting an estimate on something," Walter said. "Repairs, maybe. I almost didn't think anything of it." He looked at me directly. Then I heard what Ryan said. "What did he say?" Walter's jaw tightened slightly, like a man who's repeated a thing in his head so many times it started to taste bad. He said, "Once the old man moves into assisted living, this place will sell for close to $1 million. Chad, I need you to run the comps by next week." The kitchen went very quiet. I heard the refrigerator hum. I heard the oak tree outside move in the July breeze. I heard my own heartbeat doing something it didn't usually do on Saturday mornings. "Char, you're sure about the words?" I said. "Frank." Walter looked at me with the expression of a man who has spent 68 years being careful about what he claims to know. I was 10 feet away. The privet hedge doesn't make any noise, and I've got both my ears. I nodded slowly. The younger guy, Ryan, called him Chad. He laughed a little and said something about the kitchen needing updating, but that buyers in this market don't care. Walter's voice was even factual the way it got when he was being precise about something. Then Ryan said the bones were good, and the lot alone was worth $600. I stood up from the table, walked to the window. The backyard was green and quiet in the morning light. The pool still and flat, the wooden picnic table sitting where it had sat for 30 years, right where Ruth had wanted it. "The younger guy," I said. "Chad. He left a business card in the mailbox," Walter said. "I saw him do it on their way out. I thought that was strange, leaving a card at a house that wasn't for sale." He reached into the front pocket of his shirt and set it on the table next to Ruth's recipe box. I turned around and looked at it from across the kitchen without walking over to it yet. White card, clean design. Even from 8 feet away I could read the name. Chad Ellis. Compass Real Estate. Franklin, Tennessee. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," Walter said. His voice had gone rough at the edges, the way men's voices do when they're carrying guilt they don't think they should have to carry. I kept thinking maybe I misheard. Maybe there was some explanation. I walked back to the table and sat down. I picked up the business card and held it between my fingers. It was the kind of heavy cardstock that costs extra to print, the kind real estate agents use when they want to seem substantial. "You didn't mishear anything," I said. "No," Walter said. "I didn't." We sat there together for a while, the way men our age sit together when something heavy has just landed on a table between them. Walter poured coffee from his thermos into the mug I'd set out for him without being asked. I turned the business card over in my fingers, looking at the blank white back of it. "Me and Ryan's been here twice in the last 2 weeks," I said. "Talking about the market, talking about my equity, brought Diane by with a brochure for a place in Nashville." Walter's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "That tracks," he said quietly. "Yeah," I said. "It does." I set the card down on top of Ruth's recipe box, right next to the card, where she'd written the Sunday pot roast recipe in her careful, looping hand. 2 very different kinds of instructions for what to do with the same house. "Frank," Walter said. "What are you going to do?" I looked at him across the table. Outside, a cardinal landed on the edge of the pool for half a second, bright red against the blue water, and then was gone. "I'm going to think about it carefully," I said, "and then I'm going to do something about it." Walter nodded, like that was the right answer. He picked up his coffee and didn't say anything else. That was another thing I'd always appreciated about him. He knew when the talking was done. Walter left around 10:30. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his back disappear through the gap in the hedge between our yards, his predator's cap back on his head, his thermos swinging at his side. Then I sat back down at the table and looked at the business card. Chad Ellis, Compass Real Estate, Franklin, Tennessee. There was a phone number, a website, a small compass logo in the upper left corner that I assumed was meant to suggest direction guidance, the idea that this man could point you somewhere useful. I turned it over. Blank on the back except for a faint watermark of the same logo. I didn't reach for my phone. Instead, I got up, poured the cold coffee down the sink, made a fresh pot, and while it was brewing, I went to the living room and found the yellow legal pad I kept in the drawer of the side table next to Ruth's reading chair. She'd bought it to write grocery lists on, and somehow it had migrated to that drawer and stayed there 2/3 full of her handwriting, the last third blank. I tore off 3 blank sheets and brought them back to the kitchen. I sat down with a fresh cup of coffee and I started writing. I wrote down the date of the barbecue, the exact words Ryan had said when he shrugged at my ruined dinner, the 2 visits afterward, what day each one happened, what Ryan had said, what Diane had said, the specific language Ryan had used about the market and my equity and the facility in Nashville. I wrote down what Walter had told me, the date Walter said it happened, the words Ryan had used. Once the old man moves into assisted living, close to $1 million. Chad run the comps by next week. I wrote down Chad Ellis's name and the name of his company. Then I sat back and read what I'd written. 3 pages, maybe 25 separate items. Each one taken alone was a thing a man could explain away. A rude comment at a barbecue. A conversation about real estate prices, which Ryan had daily in his professional life. A brochure for a retirement community that Diane could have found on her own. A walk around a neighbor's property that could have been idle curiosity. Taken together, they told a different story. I thought about the way Ryan's eyes had moved around my garage on that first visit. Not the eyes of a man making conversation. The eyes of a man taking inventory. I thought about the way he'd said significant asset, not your home, not this place, but asset. A word from a different vocabulary. A transaction vocabulary. I thought about Diane's face when Ryan had suggested the Nashville facility. The way she'd leaned forward like it cost her something. The way her hands had been wrapped too tight around her coffee cup. She wasn't driving this. That much I believed. But she wasn't stopping it either. I folded the 3 pages and held them in my hands. The coffee had gone warm to cool that temperature, where it's not hot enough to be satisfying, but you keep drinking it anyway because it's there. Outside, a lawnmower started up somewhere down Lewisburg Pike, that particular Saturday sound of a neighborhood maintaining itself. I got up and walked to the spice cabinet. Opened it. Ruth's index card was still taped to the inside of the door, the way it had been taped there for the last 11 years. Garlic powder first, smoked paprika, coarse black pepper, a pinch of brown sugar last. I tucked the folded pages behind the index card between the card and the cabinet door. Then I took Chad Ellis's business card and held it for a long moment. I thought about calling him. I thought about calling Ryan. I thought about calling Diane and laying out everything Walter had told me and everything I'd just written down, and asking her directly what exactly her husband was planning to do with her father's house. I put the business card in my shirt pocket instead. There was someone else I needed to call first. Someone who had sat across from me in a small office on 5th Avenue South in downtown Franklin 3 years ago, and helped me understand what Ruth's passing meant in legal terms. Someone who had answered every question I had that day, with patience and without condescension, who had handed me a box of tissues without making a production of it, who had told me at the end of that appointment that his door was always open if I needed anything. I hadn't needed anything since. Tomorrow morning I decided I would need something. Daniel Holt's office was on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian on 5th Avenue South, 3 blocks from the Franklin Courthouse, sandwiched between a title company and an insurance agency that had been in the same spot since 1987. I'd been there once before 3 years ago, the month after Ruth died. The office smelled the same way it had then, old wood coffee and something faintly like lemon polish. The kind of smell that belongs to a place where serious things get handled seriously. Daniel was 57, trim, with close-cropped silver hair, and the unhurried manner of a man who had learned probably through experience that urgency rarely improved a legal situation. He'd handled estate law in Williamson County for nearly 30 years. He'd processed Ruth's will, her retirement accounts, the transfer of the joint savings into my name. He'd done all of it without making me feel like I was being managed. His assistant showed me in at 9:15 on Monday morning. Daniel stood when I came in, shook my hand, and gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same chair I'd sat in 3 years ago. "Frank," he said, "good to see you. I wish it were under better circumstances." I sat down. "You could tell from the phone. You said it wasn't urgent, but you needed to come in soon," he said, settling back into his own chair. "In my experience, that usually means it's urgent." I told him everything. The barbecue, the visits, what Walter had seen and heard, the business card. I told it the way I'd written it on the legal pad in order with dates without editorializing. Daniel listened the way good lawyers listen, which is without expression, taking occasional notes on a yellow pad of his own. When I finished, he set his pen down and folded his hands on the desk. "Ryan Porter contacted my office," he said. My hands tightened on the arms of the chair. "4 times, Daniel said. over the past 3 months. He opened a folder on his desk. I could see it was a call log, his assistant's handwriting in blue ink. The first call was in April. He identified himself as your son-in-law. He said he had some general questions about estate planning. What kind of questions? Daniel looked at the log. The first call, he asked what happens to a homeowner's property if the owner is declared legally incapacitated. Who controls the asset? Whether the family can make decisions about selling. My jaw tightened. The second call was 2 weeks later, Daniel said. He asked about the inheritance process, specifically if you were to pass away, and Diane was the primary beneficiary. What would the timeline look like for transferring the deed? Whether probate would be required. How long it typically takes. He was asking how long it would take to get his hands on my house, I said. Oh, that would be one interpretation, Daniel said carefully. The third call was in May. He asked whether it was possible for a family member to petition for guardianship over an elderly parent who was, and I'm reading his exact words here, showing signs of diminished capacity. The room felt smaller than it had a minute ago. What did you tell him? I asked. Hi, Tions. I told him what I'm legally required to tell anyone who calls this office asking questions that may relate to a current client, Daniel said. I told him I couldn't discuss any matter that might involve someone I represent, and that if he had specific legal needs, I'd be happy to refer him to another attorney in the county. He didn't take the referral. He called back a fourth time, Daniel said. 6 weeks ago. This time he asked whether Tennessee law allowed a power of attorney to authorize the sale of real property while the original owner was still living, specifically if that owner had been moved to a memory care facility. I stood up from the chair. Didn't mean to. My knees straightened before I'd made a conscious decision to stand the way a body sometimes reacts before the mind has finished processing something. He's not waiting for me to die, I said. He's building a case to have me declared incompetent. Daniel looked at me steadily. I think you should sit back down, Frank. I sat. I want to be precise, Daniel said. I don't know what Ryan Porter's intentions are. What I know is that the questions he asked, taken in sequence, represent a fairly coherent line of inquiry into the legal mechanisms by which an elderly homeowner can be separated from control of their property while still alive. He paused. That's not a standard set of questions from a concerned son-in-law. No, I said. It isn't. Daniel picked up his pen again. Now, I called you because I felt you had a right to know someone was asking these questions. But I also called you because there's something you can do about it. He looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses. The question is what outcome you want. I thought about Ruth's recipe box on the kitchen table. I thought about the scratch on the leg of her chair. I thought about the wooden picnic table she'd picked out at the furniture barn in Brentwood in 1994, and the Sunday pot roast recipe on the index card, taped inside the spice cabinet, and the 33 years of ordinary life that had happened inside and around and because of that house on Lewisburg Pike. I want to make sure that what Ruth and I built together can't be taken apart by someone who never helped build it, I said. Daniel nodded slowly, like that was exactly the answer he'd expected and exactly the one he could work with. He reached for a second folder thicker than the first and set it on the desk between us. Then let's talk about what we're going to do, he said. Under Tennessee law, I had more options than Ryan Porter apparently thought I did. A revocable living trust would transfer control of the property to an independent trustee, Daniel himself, while keeping me as the primary beneficiary for as long as I lived. It was fully legal, fully reversible if I chose, and it would make any petition for guardianship over the house essentially meaningless. Updated medical directives would specify in language that left no room for interpretation exactly who could and could not make decisions about my care. A revised will would close every procedural gap Ryan had been researching. "None of this is punitive," Daniel said. "It's protective. You're not taking anything from anyone. You're simply making sure that your wishes are documented clearly enough that they can't be reinterpreted." "How long will it take?" I asked. 3 weeks, he said. "Maybe 4. I looked at him across the desk. Outside, a truck rumbled down 5th Avenue South, and somewhere in the building the old radiator clicked and settled. "Start today," I said. Daniel uncapped his pen and pulled the thick folder closer. For the first time since Walter had sat down at my kitchen table on Saturday morning and started turning his predator's cap in his hands, I felt something in my chest that wasn't dread. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something closer to purpose. A man who spent 35 years working with structural steel learns one thing above everything else: the best time to reinforce a joint is before the weight comes down on it. The weight was coming. I could feel it. But I wasn't going to be standing on the wrong side of it when it did. The Wednesday after I met with Daniel, Diane showed up at my front door at 6:15 in the evening, carrying a container of leftover pasta from the restaurant she and Ryan liked in Brentwood. She was alone. That was the first thing I noticed. No Ryan behind her. No sound of his Mercedes in the driveway. Just Diane standing on my porch in her blue nursing scrubs with dark circles under her eyes and a container of food she held out like a peace offering. "I made too much," she said. Or the restaurant did. Either way. "Come in," I said. She set the pasta on the counter and looked around the kitchen the way people look around a room they grew up in when they haven't been in it for a while, checking that things are where they're supposed to be, that the world is still organized the way they remember it. Her eyes landed on Ruth's recipe box beside the stove. They stayed there for a moment. "You doing okay, Dad?" I'm doing fine," I said. "Sit down. I'll make coffee." She sat in her usual chair, not Ruth's. She never sat in Ruth's, even now, and watched me move around the kitchen. I could feel her working up to something. Diane had never been able to hide it, even as a child. When she had something difficult to say, she got very still and very careful, like she was carrying a full glass of water across a slippery floor. We talked about her week first. A difficult case on the pediatric ward, a 4-year-old with a heart condition who had finally stabilized after 2 weeks of uncertainty. Diane's voice went soft and grateful when she talked about that little girl going home. That softness was Ruth in her pure and unchanged, and it made my chest ache in the good way and the bad way simultaneously. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "Dad," she said, "I have something to tell you." I looked at her across the table. Her eyes filled up so fast it surprised her. She blinked hard, pressed her lips together, then let out a breath that shook slightly at the edges. Her right hand moved from the mug to her abdomen, just rested there, flat and instinctive, the way hands know things before minds do. "I'm pregnant," she said. 4 months. The word hit me somewhere behind the sternum and spread outward like heat. 4 months. That meant since March. That meant she'd been carrying this since early spring, through everything, through the barbecue and the visits and the phone calls and all of it. I got up from my chair, walked around the table. She stood up to meet me, and I held her the way I'd held her when she was small, and the world had been too big and too loud. Her head against my shoulder, my arms around her, her crying quietly against my collar in that specific way she'd cried since she was 3 years old, breaths uneven and close together. "A baby?" I said. "A baby," she said, and laughed a little through the tears. We stood like that for a while, I felt her breathing slow down and even out. Outside the kitchen window, the evening light was going golden across the backyard, falling across the old picnic table and the surface of the pool. She pulled back and wiped her face with the back of her hand, smiling the way people smile when they've been crying and want to indicate they're fine now. "Ryan's excited," she said. "I imagine he is," I said. Something in my voice must have landed slightly flat, because she looked at me with an expression that was searching and careful at the same time. "Dad, I know things have been tense." "They have," I agreed. "I want the baby to know its grandfather," she said. Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly. I want Sunday dinners. I want the smell of that grill in the backyard. I want this house to be something the baby grows up knowing." I looked at my daughter's face. Ruth's eyes, Ruth's way of meaning every word she said, and I believed her completely. Every syllable of it. She left around 8:30. I walked her to her car, watched her back out of the driveway, waved at the taillights until they turned the corner onto Lewisburg Pike. Then I went to the garage. I didn't turn on the overhead light right away. I just sat on the old wooden stool beside the workbench in the dark, listening to the neighborhood settle into night. The framed photo of me and Ruth at our 25th anniversary was a pale rectangle on the shelf to my right. I didn't need the light to know what it looked like. Ruth laughing because I'd burned the first batch of burgers. Me looking at her instead of the camera. Ryan had known about the pregnancy since March. He'd started calling Daniel Holt's office in April. I sat with that sequence for a long time in the dark. A man who loved his wife and was expecting a child would have led with that news. He would have called me or brought Diane over to tell me together, or at minimum mentioned it in the weeks of visits and conversations that followed. Instead, he'd mentioned the market, the equity, the facility in Nashville. He was going to use this baby the same way he used everything else as leverage. Sign the papers, sell the house, move into the facility. Do it for the baby. Do it for Diane. Do it for the family. I pressed my palms flat against the workbench and stared at the dark shape of the garage wall. I won't let that happen. I said to Ruth, to the dark, to whatever part of her might still be in the corners of this garage she'd always teased me about loving too much. Not to this house. Not to this family. My phone buzzed on the workbench. A text from Daniel Holt. "Frank, first documents are ready for your review. Can you come in Thursday morning?" I picked up the phone. Typed back, "I'll be there at 9. Then I set the phone down and sat a while longer in the dark, thinking about a baby who didn't have a name yet, and a house that had been someone's home for 33 years, and the difference between a family and a transaction. The paperwork Daniel told me on Thursday morning was going to feel like a lot. He wasn't wrong. Over the following 3 weeks, I sat across from Daniel Holt's desk more times than I'd sat in a doctor's office in the previous 5 years. Each meeting was 2 hours, sometimes 3. Each one produced documents dense, careful, precise in the way legal documents are precise, which is to say they say exactly what they mean and leave no room for someone to decide they mean something else. The first thing we established was the revocable living trust. Daniel explained it to me in plain language, which I appreciated. "You transfer the house legally on paper into the trust," he said. "The trust is its own entity. I become the independent trustee, which means I manage it according to your instructions. You remain the primary beneficiary, meaning you live there, you maintain it. Nothing changes in your daily life. But the house is no longer owned by Frank Callahan, the individual. It's owned by the Frank and Ruth Callahan Family Trust." He set his pen down. "Which means that any legal action aimed at Frank Callahan, the individual, any petition for guardianship, any argument about your capacity to manage assets, has no effect on the house. They're separate entities under Tennessee law. Sticking, Ryan can't petition to sell a house he doesn't have legal standing to contest, I said. Correct, Daniel said. And since Diane is not named as trustee, her signature isn't required for any property decision either. I sat with that for a moment. She's still in the will? Of course, Daniel said. The trust doesn't change what happens after you're gone. It only protects what happens while you're here. The second document was the updated medical directive. Under Tennessee law, a medical directive, sometimes called a living will, specifies exactly what medical interventions you do and don't consent to, and more importantly, designates who has the legal authority to make healthcare decisions if you can't make them yourself. I named Daniel as my healthcare agent, not Diane, not anyone in the family. That's a significant decision, Daniel said, not pushing, just noting. I know, I said. I'm not doing it because I don't trust Diane. I'm doing it because I don't trust who's standing next to her. Daniel nodded and wrote it down. The third piece was the revised will. We went through it line by line, closing the procedural gaps that Ryan had been researching in his 4 phone calls. The questions about probate timelines, about power of attorney, about the transfer of real property. Every gap got language. Every ambiguity got definition. In the evenings back at the house, I worked on something Daniel hadn't suggested, but hadn't discouraged either. Tennessee is a one-party consent state when it comes to recording conversations. That means that under Tennessee Code Annotated Section 39-13-601, a person who is part of a conversation is legally permitted to record that conversation without informing the other parties. I looked it up twice to be sure, then called Daniel to confirm, and he confirmed it. I started keeping my phone in my shirt pocket during Ryan's visits with the voice memo app running. The first recording I got was a Tuesday afternoon, Ryan stopping by unannounced, the way he'd taken to doing standing in my kitchen while I made coffee, talking about a development project in Spring Hill that was going to change the whole corridor. He mentioned my house twice, once calling it this property, and once calling it the Lewisburg asset. Not my home. An asset. I kept my face neutral and poured the coffee. The second recording was a phone call 3 days later, Ryan checking in, asking if I'd given any more thought to the Nashville facility. They have a waiting list? He said. So if you're even considering it, we should probably get your name on it sooner rather than later. His voice was pleasant, helpful, the voice of a man doing a reasonable thing for a reasonable reason. I said I'd think about it. Then I uploaded both recordings to a folder on my laptop and emailed them to Daniel. By the first week of August, the trust documents were signed. The medical directive was filed. The will was updated and witnessed. Daniel kept the originals in his office safe. I kept copies in a fireproof lockbox in the garage behind the shelf of motor oil in a spot Ruth had always wanted me to use for storing important documents, and that I'd always used for storing extra socket sets. She would have found that funny. The morning after I signed the final document, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and realized that for the first time in 2 months, I hadn't woken up at 3 a.m. running through scenarios in my head. The anxiety that had been sitting in my chest since Walter told me about Chad Ellis had not disappeared, but it had changed character. It had gone from formless dread to something with edges, something I could put my hands on, Daniel called that afternoon. Everything's in order, he said. How are you feeling? Steadier, I said. Good. A pause. Frank, I want to be clear, Ryan Porter doesn't know any of this has happened. The trust is a matter of public record eventually, but it won't appear in any search he might run for weeks, maybe longer. I know, I said. Which means, Daniel said carefully, that if he has something planned, he may still try to execute it. I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. The picnic table, the pool, the oak tree throwing its afternoon shadow across the lawn. "Let him," I said. The text came on a Thursday evening near the end of August while I was sitting on the back porch, watching the light go out of the sky over Franklin. It was from Diane. "Dad, Ryan thinks it would be nice to do a Sunday BBQ like we used to. Get everyone together. It's been too long. Are you up for it?" Maybe 2 weeks from Sunday, I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone face down on the arm of the porch chair and looked at the backyard for a long while. The oak tree was starting to show the first faint hints of change at the outer edges of its canopy, not fall yet. Not even close, but that particular late August quality of light that makes the green look slightly tired. Like summer is beginning to think about what comes next. 2 weeks from Sunday would be the second week of September. I picked the phone back up and read the message again. "Ryan thinks it would be nice. Not Diane thinks. Not we think. Ryan thinks." She'd written it without seeming to notice the distinction, but it was there. I went inside, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the kitchen counter thinking about Ryan Porter and the specific way his mind worked. I'd spent enough time watching him over the past 2 months to understand his approach. He didn't force things directly. He set up conditions. He arranged the furniture of a situation until the outcome he wanted became the path of least resistance. A Sunday BBQ. Everyone together. The old tradition, the warm setting the family gathered around the table Ruth had picked out in 1994. Relatives who hadn't seen the tension up close. People who would naturally assume that a son-in-law organizing a family dinner was a generous and loving thing to do. And in the middle of it, documents. Papers that needed signing. A conversation in front of witnesses who would only see a caring family trying to help an aging father make responsible decisions. I called Daniel Holt. He picked up on the second ring. "Frank, Ryan's organizing a Sunday barbecue," I said. 2 weeks from this Sunday. He wants everyone there." A brief pause. "How many people?" "Family, neighbors. Could be 10, 12 people. Walter will be invited. Probably my sister Carol and her husband. Maybe some of Ruth's friends." "And you think he plans to use the occasion to pressure you?" I think he plans to use the occasion to corner me," I said. "There's a difference. Pressure is what he's been doing for 2 months. Cornering is when you do it in front of an audience so the other person can't say no without looking unreasonable." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. The picnic table sat in the late evening light, solid, and still the wood grain showing all 30 years of Tennessee summers in its surface. "I want to say yes," I said. Another pause, this one longer. "Frank, I want to say yes," I repeated, "and I want you there." The silence on Daniel's end had a different quality now. I could almost hear him thinking through it, the logistics, the implications, the particular legal and human geometry of what I was proposing. "You understand," he said slowly, "that if I attend a family gathering in my professional capacity, Ryan will know immediately that something is different." "I'm counting on it," I said. "He'll be defensive. He may become hostile. He was going to do that anyway," I said. "The difference is that in 2 weeks when he gets hostile, everything I need will already be on the table." Daniel made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that neighborhood. "You've been thinking about this." "I've had 2 months and a lot of quiet evenings," I said. "Just all right." His voice settled into its professional register, the one that meant he'd made a decision and was moving forward. "I'll be there. But I want to be clear about something. I'm not coming to ambush anyone. I'm coming to present facts, documented, legal, verifiable facts. Whatever Ryan does with those facts is his choice. That's all I'm asking, I said. What time? Say 3 o'clock. I'll start the grill at 2. I'll be there at 3, he said. And Frank, cook enough. I haven't had a proper barbecue since my brother-in-law moved to Arizona. I almost smiled at that. Almost. I'll make sure there's plenty. We hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, phone still in my hand, looking at Ruth's recipe box on the counter. Then I picked up my phone and texted Diane back. Tell Ryan that sounds good. Make sure everyone comes. The more the better. I set the phone on the counter and opened the recipe box. Pulled out the index card for the dry rub, the one Ruth had written in her careful looping hand. The blue ink faded to near gray, in places the edges soft, from 30 years of Sunday mornings. Garlic powder first, then smoked paprika, coarse black pepper, a pinch of brown sugar last. I was going to need 4 pounds of ribeye at minimum. Maybe 5. Ruth always said the secret to a good Sunday barbecue was preparation. You didn't wait until Sunday morning to think about what you were going to cook. You planned it out. You got everything you needed ahead of time. You made sure that when the moment came, you were ready. She was talking about meat and seasoning, but she was also, I thought, talking about everything else. I put the index card back in the box, closed the lid, and started making a grocery list. 2 weeks from Sunday, Ryan Porter was going to sit down at the table Ruth had picked out in 1994 and try to take apart everything we had built. He had no idea that the table and everyone sitting around it was already ready for him. The grocery run took me 40 minutes on Monday morning. I drove out to the butcher on Mac Hatcher Parkway, not the supermarket, the actual butcher, a place called Caldwell's that had been in the same spot since 1978, and where the man behind the counter still knew your name if you came in more than twice. I ordered 5 pounds of bone-in ribeye, cut 1.25 inches thick the way Ruth always specified. The butcher, a heavy-set man named Gene with forearms like fence posts, wrapped each steak individually in white butcher paper and stacked them in a bag without being asked. Special occasion, he said. Something like that, I said. I stopped at the hardware store on the way home and picked up a new bag of hickory chunks for the smoker box. Ruth had always insisted on hickory. She said the smoke had to have personality, that plain charcoal was fine for weeknights, but Sundays required something with character. Back home, I started the week the way I always started the week before a big Sunday, methodically and without rushing. Monday, I cleaned the grill, scraped the grates, checked the propane on the side burner, even though I'd be using charcoal. Tuesday, I pulled the picnic table away from the tree line and scrubbed it down with soapy water, let it dry in the afternoon sun. The wood was holding up well, still solid at the joints. The grain weathered silver gray, in the way old Tennessee oak gets when it's been through enough summers to stop caring about appearances. Wednesday evening, Walter came over. He didn't knock. He came around the side of the house the way he always had for 22 years, appearing at the back corner of the yard, like he'd materialized out of the hedge. "You actually cleaning that table?" he said, watching me apply a coat of teak oil to the surface. "Every year," I said. "Ruth's rule." He pulled up a lawn chair and sat down, stretching his legs out in front of him. The evening was warm and soft, the kind of late August air that feels like summer making a last argument for itself before September arrives and wins. "Frank," he said, "you want to tell me what's actually happening Sunday?" I kept working the oil into the wood with a clean rag moving in slow circles, the way the instructions said to, even though Ruth had never read any instructions in her life, and her table had always looked better than everyone else's. "Ryan's planning to use it," I said. "The gathering. He's going to bring paperwork. He's going to wait until everyone's comfortable and the food's good and the mood is warm, and then he's going to lay something on the table and make it very difficult for me to say no without looking like the difficult one. Walter's jaw tightened. And you're going to let him do that? I'm going to let him start, I said. There's a difference. I told him what I needed from him. Not much, just the truth, exactly as he'd told it to me that Saturday morning in July. The walk around the property, Chad Ellis with his leather portfolio, the words Ryan had said. Walter listened, and when I finished, he nodded once, the way a man nods when he's already decided. I'll say what I saw and what I heard, he said. Same as always. That's all I need, I said. Thursday. I pulled Ruth's recipe box out and spent an evening going through the index cards. Not just the dry rub, all of them. The potato salad recipe with the note in the margin that said add more mustard than you think you need. The corn salad she made every summer with the cherry tomatoes from the garden. The sweet tea recipe with the handwritten reminder that said, do not use the yellow pitcher. It leaks. I still had the yellow pitcher. I still used the right one. Friday evening, I sat in the garage with the album Ruth had kept on the bottom shelf of the bookcase in the living room, the one that started with our first apartment in 1989 and ended somewhere around 2018 when she'd stopped printing photographs, because she said printing them made her feel old. I turned to the pages from the early 90s. Ruth at the first Sunday BBQ 1994, standing beside the picnic table the week after we'd brought it home, grinning like she'd won something. Diane at age 6, face smeared with barbecue sauce, holding up a chicken leg like a trophy. Me at the grill, younger, more hair, looking at the camera with the expression of a man who has no idea how good he has it. I closed the album and sat with it in my lap. We built something real, Ruth, I said. I'm going to make sure it stays that way. Saturday morning, Daniel Holt called to confirm. 3 o'clock, he said. I'll come around the back. A pause. And Frank, stay calm Sunday. Whatever Ryan says, whatever he does, let it play out. Don't react. Just let it happen. I know, I said. You've done the work, Daniel said. Trust the work. I hung up and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard. The picnic table gleamed faintly in the morning light, the teak oil doing what it was supposed to do. 5 pounds of ribeye were in the refrigerator, dry rubbed since Thursday night, wrapped in the same white butcher paper from Caldwell's developing flavor, the way good things develop slowly, quietly, without anyone needing to check on them. Sunday was coming. I was ready. The first car pulled into my driveway at 1:15. It was Carol, my younger sister, 61 years old, a retired school librarian, who had driven up from Murfreesboro with her husband Jim and a Tupperware container of her famous banana pudding. Carol had Ruth's number on speed dial for 20 years, and when Ruth died, she'd cried harder than almost anyone at the service. She hugged me at the back gate with both arms and held on for an extra second the way she always did since the funeral. You look good, Frank, she said, pulling back and examining my face with the specific, critical affection of a younger sister. I feel good, I said. She studied me a moment longer, like she wasn't sure she believed me, but had decided not to push it. Then she handed me the banana pudding and went to find a seat in the shade. My nephew Kevin arrived next. Carol's son, 34 years old, a contractor who'd helped me re-shingle the garage roof 2 summers ago. Kevin was one of those young men who never stopped moving. He immediately started helping me arrange the folding chairs, asking about the grill setup, pulling the cooler out from the garage without being asked. Margaret Briley and Helen Ashworth arrived together at 1:30. Margaret and Helen had been Ruth's closest friends for over 20 years, part of the same church, women's group, the same book club, the same Wednesday morning walking group that Ruth had organized, and that had continued meeting after her death as a way of honoring her. They both hugged me the way women of a certain generation hug men who have been widowed with intention, with warmth, and with the particular tenderness of people who knew and loved the person who was missing. She would have loved this, Margaret said, looking around the backyard with bright eyes. She always said Sunday afternoons were God's apology for Monday mornings. My throat tightened. She did say that, I said. Walter appeared from the gap in the hedge at 1:45 Predator's Cap, and all carrying his thermos and a store-bought pie, he sat on the table without comment. He caught my eye when he sat down in his usual chair at the end of the table, gave me a small nod, and opened his thermos. The ribeyes were resting under foil on the side table. The hickory smoke was doing exactly what Ruth had always said it should, giving the air personality. The potato salad was in Ruth's yellow bowl, the one that didn't leak. The sweet tea was in the right pitcher. Everything was exactly the way it was supposed to be. Ryan and Diane arrived at 2 o'clock. Ryan came through the back gate in pressed slacks and a collared shirt, carrying a canvas tote bag that was slightly too full to be casual. His eyes swept the yard the moment he stepped in, counting heads, I realized. Making the same kind of calculation a man makes when he walks into a room and wants to know whether the numbers are in his favor. He spotted Walter, and his expression flickered so briefly that someone who wasn't watching carefully would have missed it. Diane walked behind him, one hand resting lightly on her abdomen. Her face was carefully composed, the professional calm of a woman who spent her working days managing anxiety in small rooms. She kissed my cheek and squeezed my arm and said, "Hi, Dad," in a voice that carried too much weight for those 2 syllables. "Diane," I said, "you look beautiful." Her eyes filled up briefly. She blinked it back. "The food smells incredible." "Your mother's recipe," I said. "Same as always." Ryan set the canvas tote on the empty chair beside his seat. He shook my hand with that firm, deliberate grip of his and said, "Frank, this is wonderful. Really. This is exactly what we all needed." "Glad you think so," I said. We ate at 2:30. The ribeyes were perfect. Ruth's dry rub doing what it had done every Sunday for 30 years. The brown sugar giving the crust that particular dark sweetness that made people close their eyes when they took the first bite. Carol ate hers and said it tasted like 1998. Kevin had 2 helpings of potato salad. Margaret told a story about Ruth that made everyone laugh, and then made Helen cry, and then made everyone laugh again. Ryan ate and smiled and made conversation, and kept his right hand resting on top of the canvas tote at the empty chair beside him, the way a man keeps his hand near something he's going to need. I watched him from the other end of the table and said nothing. Around 3:30, the plates were being cleared, and the sweet tea was going around for the second time. Kevin was telling a story about a roofing job in Brentwood that had gone sideways in a way that was apparently very funny. Everyone was laughing. Ryan reached into the canvas tote. He pulled out a folder, thick cream-colored, the kind of presentation folder that real estate offices use for proposals they want to look significant. He set it on the table in front of him and cleared his throat. The laughter around the table tapered off the way laughter does when it senses the temperature of a room changing. "I hope nobody minds." Ryan set his voice warm and measured the voice of a man who had rehearsed this moment. "But I wanted to take a few minutes while everyone's here, people who love Frank, to talk about something important. Before I show you exactly what happened at that table the moment nobody saw coming, comment Sunday and let me know you're here for it. A reminder, some details ahead have been shaped for narrative purposes. If you'd rather not continue, this is a perfectly fine place to stop." Nobody moved to stop him. That was the thing about Ryan. He understood the social physics of a situation. He knew that in a gathering like this, with food on the table and family in the chairs and the warm residue of a good afternoon still in the air, the person who speaks with calm authority is the person everyone instinctively defers to. He'd built a career on it. He opened the folder. Inside were 3 documents neatly separated by colored tabs. He didn't pick them up immediately. He let the folder sit open, visible, but not yet pushed forward the way a negotiator lets an offer breathe before making the other party respond to it. Frank has meant everything to this family. Ryan began, and his voice had that quality of genuine warmth that I had learned over the past 2 months to distrust completely. He built this home. He raised an incredible woman. He glanced at Diane, and Diane's expression was complicated in the way expressions get when they're carrying more than one emotion and don't have room to put all of them. And now that Frank is getting older, we all want to make sure he's protected, that he's taken care of, that the decisions that need to be made get made while everyone is still healthy and clear-headed and able to make them well. Margaret looked at me. I gave her a small, calm smile. Ryan laid his hand flat on the folder. I've been working with a senior transition specialist. That's someone who helps families plan for the next chapter. And what we've put together is something that protects Frank's interests, makes sure his finances are managed responsibly, and gives Diane and me the ability to make sure he always has what he needs. He paused. The house would be put into a managed sale process. Frank would move to a wonderful facility in Green Hills. I've toured it myself. It's genuinely exceptional. And the proceeds from the sale would fund his care for the rest of his life, with anything remaining going to Diane. Helen's hands tightened around her sweet tea glass. Kevin stopped examining the tablecloth and looked up. Ryan slid the folder forward. It's a big decision, I know, he said, his voice softening. But we're all here today because we love Frank. And sometimes love means having the hard conversations. Diane reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her fingers were trembling slightly, the fine tremor of someone who is holding themselves very still by effort. Her eyes were red at the rims. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice dropping the way it did when she needed me to really hear her. "Please, just look at it. For the baby. So we know you're secure." The table was very quiet. I looked at Diane's hand over mine. I looked at the folder with its 3 tabbed documents. I looked at Ryan, who was watching me with an expression of practiced patience, his hand still resting on the edge of the folder, his body language radiating the calm confidence of a man who believes the outcome is already decided. Carol was rigid in her chair, her banana pudding spoon set down precisely beside her bowl. Walter was watching Ryan with the flat, steady attention of a man who has seen something he expected to see and is not surprised by it. Margaret had pressed her lips together so tightly they'd gone pale. I looked at the folder for a long moment. Then I looked up at Ryan. "Okay," I said. I said it calmly, the way you might say it to someone who has just told you the weather forecast. Just a word. Just an acknowledgement carrying no more weight than its 2 letters suggested. Ryan's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch with relief. He reached for the pen in his shirt pocket. "I think once you look at the back gate opened, not loudly, not dramatically. It swung open with the same mild creak it had made for 15 years, the one I kept meaning to oil and never got around to. But every head at the table turned toward it. Daniel Holt stepped into the backyard. He was wearing a navy sport coat over a collared shirt, carrying his brown leather briefcase in his left hand. He looked the way he always looked, composed, unhurried, like a man who had arrived at exactly the time he intended to arrive. Ryan's pen stopped moving. "Good afternoon," Daniel said pleasantly to the table in general, to no one in particular. His eyes found mine. I gave him the same small nod he'd given me across many desks. Ryan's voice came out slightly tighter than before. "Who is Frank? Who is this? I looked at Ryan across the table, across 30 years of Sunday afternoons, across the folder, with its 3 tabbed documents, and its colored transitions, and its plan for dismantling everything Ruth and I had built. "This," I said, "is my attorney." Ryan's face did something complicated. The warmth drained out of it in the specific way warmth drains from a performance when the performer realizes the audience already knows the ending. Daniel set his briefcase on the corner of the table politely, carefully, without displacing anything, and introduced himself to the group with the same professional ease he brought to every room he entered. He shook Carol's hand. He nodded to Walter. He smiled at Margaret and Helen. Then he set his briefcase flat, unlatched the clasps with 2 clean clicks, and looked at Ryan Porter with the expression of a man who has been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. "Mr. Porter," he said pleasantly, "I'm glad you suggested everyone be here today. This is going to save us all a great deal of time." Ryan's grip on his pen tightened until his knuckles went pale. Diane looked at her husband, then at Daniel, then at me, and in her eyes I saw the first real crack in the careful composure she'd been maintaining all afternoon. Not anger, not blame, something rawer than either of those. The expression of a woman who is beginning to understand that the story she's been living inside has a different shape than she thought. "Frank," she whispered, "what's going on?" "The truth," I said quietly. "That's all. Just the truth." Daniel set his briefcase on the corner of the picnic table, not at the center, not in front of Ryan's folder. At the corner. Present, visible, but not aggressive. A statement, not a threat. At least not yet. He introduced himself to Carol first. Extended his hand, said his name, said he'd worked with Frank for several years. Carol shook his hand and said nothing, but her spine straightened, the way a person straightens when the individual they've been waiting for has finally arrived. He nodded to Margaret and Helen. He found Walter at the end of the table and gave him a look, not a handshake, just an acknowledgement between 2 men who already understood each other's role in this afternoon. Ryan had collected himself. The color had come back into his face, replaced by something harder, the expression of a man who has been caught off guard and refuses to show it. He stood from his chair, which was either authority or flight instinct, that stopped halfway. "This is a family gathering, Frank." Ryan's voice was controlled but thin at the edges, like a wire pulled past its rated load. "Not a whatever this is." "Sit down, Ryan," I said. Not loudly. The way you say something that was never a question. Ryan looked at me, then at Daniel, then at the briefcase. He sat. Daniel remained standing. He addressed the table in the same measured voice I'd heard across his desk 100 times, clear, unhurried, without theater. "My name is Daniel Holt. I'm a licensed attorney practicing estate and property law in Williamson County. I've represented Frank Callahan for several years, most recently, in connection with his wife Ruth's estate." He paused. "I'm here because over the past 3 months, a pattern of activity has come to Frank's attention that directly concerns his legal rights as a homeowner and as a competent adult. Frank asked me to share the relevant facts with everyone who loves him." He looked at Ryan. "All of them." Ryan's hand moved toward the canvas tote and stopped. He changed tactics. "Mr. Holt, Frank's family is perfectly capable of discussing his future without legal counsel. I think there's been a misunderstanding." "You may be right," Daniel said pleasantly. "Let's find out together." He unlatched the briefcase. The 2 clicks were the loudest sounds in the backyard. He withdrew 3 folders and set them beside Ryan's cream-colored proposal, the way a card player lays down a hand. No rushing, no performance. Just placing things where they needed to be. Diane's eyes moved from the folders to her husband to me and back. Her hand drifted to her abdomen, the same instinctive gesture from the evening she'd told me about the baby. Her jaw muscles worked beneath the skin. Ryan Porter contacted my office on 4 separate occasions between April and June of this year, Daniel said, opening the first folder. My assistant logged each call, the date's duration and substance of each inquiry. He looked at Ryan. Would you like to tell everyone what those calls were about, or shall I? Ryan's fingers spread flat on the table, pressing down. I made general inquiries about estate planning. That's not unusual. On April 3rd, Daniel read, You asked what happens to a homeowner's real property when the owner is declared legally incapacitated, specifically who gains control of the asset and whether the family can initiate a sale. Carol made a sound that wasn't a word. On April 18th, you asked about Tennessee's probate process, how long it takes to transfer title after an owner's death, whether the process could be expedited. Helen's sweet tea glass touched the table with a sharp, unintended click. On May 9th, you asked whether a family member can petition a Tennessee court for guardianship over an elderly parent showing, and I'm using your exact words, signs of diminished capacity. You asked what medical documentation would be required. The yard went so still I could hear the oak tree moving. Ryan cleared his throat. Those were hypothetical. I work in real estate. I think about these things professionally. Mr. Porter. Daniel's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I've practiced law in this county for 29 years. Hypothetical questions about a specific elderly homeowner's incapacity, asked by that homeowner's son-in-law over 3 months, are not hypothetical. Diane turned and looked at her husband, not the uncertain look from earlier, something different. The look of a woman who has just heard something she cannot unhear and is deciding what to do with the weight of it. Ryan. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. You called his lawyer? Diane, I was planning ahead. For us. For the baby. You called my father's attorney, she said, and asked how to have him declared incompetent. The words dropped onto the table like something falling from a great height. Ryan opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. That is not what That's the third call. Diane's voice had gone very quiet, and in my 36 years of knowing my daughter quiet meant she was further past the edge than shouting ever could. You asked about guardianship. You asked how to prove diminished capacity. Her eyes filled fast, and she didn't blink them clear. He's not diminished. He built that grill. He made this food. He has sat here all afternoon being more patient with you than you have ever deserved. Ryan reached for her hand. She pulled it back. Daniel gave them 1 moment. Exactly 1. Then he opened the second folder. Steif. The 4th call. Daniel said came on June 2nd, 3 weeks before the barbecue, where Mr. Porter knocked Frank's dinner off the table. He said it plainly, without inflection, without editorial. Just a fact in a sequence of facts. But the timing of it landed in the yard like a stone in still water, and the ripples went out in every direction. Carol turned and looked at Ryan with an expression that had passed through surprise and arrived somewhere much colder. Kevin set both elbows on the table and leaned forward, his jaw tight in the way young men's jaws get when they're angry and have been taught not to show it. On June 2nd, Daniel said, reading from the log, Mr. Porter asked whether a durable power of attorney could authorize the sale of real property while the original owner was still living, specifically if that owner had been moved to a memory care facility. He asked whether the owner's signature would be required or whether the power of attorney would be sufficient. Margaret Briley put both hands flat on the table and said, Lord have mercy. In the quiet, specific way she said things, when she meant them completely. Ryan pushed back from the table. Not standing, just creating distance, the physical instinct of a man who wants room. You are taking 4 phone calls and constructing a narrative that... Ryan. My voice was calm. Let him finish. Ryan looked at me. Something moved behind his eyes, the calculation I'd been watching for months, running the numbers, assessing the room. He stayed in his chair. Daniel closed the first folder and opened the second. Frank, Daniel said, looking at me. In August, you informed me that Ryan Porter had made several visits to your home in which he raised the topic of selling the property. You indicated that during those visits he referred to your home as, and these are the words Frank recorded, this property and the Lewisburg asset. He reached into the second folder and withdrew a single printed page, a transcript. Under Tennessee Code, Annotated Section 39-13-601 Tennessee is a one-party consent state with respect to the recording of conversations. This means that a participant in a conversation may legally record that conversation without the knowledge or consent of the other parties. He set the transcript on the table. Frank was a participant in these conversations. The recordings are legally obtained. Ryan stared at the transcript. The color that had come back into his face after the initial shock began to drain again slowly, like water finding its level. The first recording, Daniel said, is from a Tuesday afternoon in late July. Mr. Porter visited Frank at his home unannounced. During that visit, Mr. Porter referred to Frank's home as the Lewisburg asset and stated, and I'm quoting directly, "You're sitting on a significant piece of real estate, Frank. At some point, the smart move is to liquidate and simplify." He looked up from the transcript. Liquidate. That's the word he used. About the house where Frank and Ruth Callahan raised their daughter. Helen reached over and took Margaret's hand. The second recording, Daniel continued, is from a phone call in early August. Mr. Porter called Frank and raised the subject of the Green Hills facility. During that call, Mr. Porter stated, and again, I'm quoting, "They have a waiting list, so if you're even considering it, we should probably get your name on it sooner rather than later." He closed the second folder. Diane had both hands in her lap, now pressed flat against her thighs. Tears were running down her face without any corresponding sound, the specific kind of crying that happens when someone is too stunned to make noise, when the body is expressing something the mind hasn't finished processing. She was looking at Ryan with an expression I had never seen on my daughter's face in 36 years. It wasn't anger, it was grief. The particular grief of someone realizing that a thing they trusted was not what they believed it to be. "Diane," Ryan said, turning to her. His voice had shifted again. The professional smoothness was gone, now replaced by something more urgent, more personal. "Diane, listen to me. Everything I did because I was worried. About the future. About our family. About what happens if Frank needs care and we're not prepared. You called his lawyer and asked how to take his house," Diane said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but every person at the table heard it perfectly. "While he was inviting us to dinner every Sunday. While he was cooking for us. While he was..." She stopped, pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment, then took it away. "Ryan, he still uses Mom's recipe. Every single Sunday. He still makes her food. At her table. And you were standing in his driveway, taking pictures of his roof." Ryan's mouth opened. Carol said quietly, but with total clarity, "Don't." Ryan closed his mouth. Kevin stood up from the table. Not aggressively, he just stood the way people stand when they need to do something with their body that sitting won't accommodate. He walked to the edge of the patio, and stood with his back to the table, hands on his hips, looking out at the yard. Walter had not moved, had not changed expression. He sat at the end of the table with his thermos and his predator's cap, and the complete stillness of a man who had already said everything he was going to say before he sat down. Ryan looked around the table. He looked at Carol, who was looking at the tablecloth. He looked at Helen, who was looking at Margaret. He looked at Kevin's back. He looked at Walter, who met his gaze with the flat, steady attention of a man who is not impressed and is not pretending to be. Ryan looked at me. "Frank," he said, and now his voice had something in it I hadn't heard before. Not warmth, not calculation, but something thinner. Something that sounded almost like a man who has just understood something about where he is. "Frank, I think we got off on the wrong foot here. I think if we could just—" Walter, Daniel said, without looking away from his folder. "I believe you have something to add." Walter Gaines set his thermos down on the table with a soft, deliberate sound, and stood up. Walter didn't have a briefcase. He didn't have a folder or a transcript or a log with dates and durations written in blue ink. He had 22 years of living next door to Frank and Ruth Callahan, and a Saturday morning in June when he'd been trimming the privet hedge and hadn't been wearing headphones. That turned out to be enough. He stood at his end of the table, the way men stand when they're not performing anything. Weight-balanced hands loose at his sides, looking directly at Ryan Porter with the uncomplicated directness of someone who has nothing to protect and nothing to gain. About a month before that Sunday barbecue, Walter said I was out front trimming the hedge along the property line. It was a Thursday morning, maybe 9:30, 10 o'clock. Ryan pulled up in his car. He had someone with him, younger man dressed for a listing appointment. Dark suit, leather portfolio. Ryan's chair scraped back slightly. "Walter, I'm talking," Walter said, not loudly, but with a finality that stopped Ryan mid-syllable. Ryan sat back. "They walked the property," Walter said. "The whole perimeter. Front yard, along the side fence, around the back." The younger man was taking notes on his phone. Ryan was pointing things out. The roof line, the lot dimensions, the pool. Walter paused, and in the pause, the oak tree moved and the September light shifted across the yard. "I figured maybe they were getting an estimate on repairs. I almost let it go." He looked directly at Ryan. Then I heard what Ryan said to the younger man. Walter's voice was even factual, the voice of a man giving a deposition. He said, "Once the old man moves into assisted living, this place will sell for close to $1 million. Chad, I need you to run the comps by next week." Diane made a sound, like the air going out of something. Carol's hand came down on the table, flat, hard, not a slam, but close. She pressed her palm against the wood and breathed. Margaret Briley stood up from her chair. She was 71 years old, and she stood up the way people stand up when something has been said that requires them to be on their feet. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, one hand resting on the table, looking at Ryan Porter, with an expression that Ruth would have recognized immediately, because Ruth had worn the same expression on occasion, the expression of a woman who has extended grace further than it deserved and has now arrived at the end of it. Ryan's face had gone the color of old concrete. That is, I was speaking loosely. It was a professional conversation about— "You called me the old man," I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected. Not angry, just present. Just there, sitting in the middle of the yard, where 30 years of Sunday afternoons had happened. Ryan looked at me, and for 1 second, just one, the performance dropped entirely. The smooth real estate agent, the concerned son-in-law, the man with the folders and the rehearsed warmth, all of it fell away, and what was underneath was something much simpler. A man who had been caught. "Frank, You were standing in my driveway, I said, telling someone my house would pay for your next deal. And then you came inside and ate my food and told me you were worried about my future. The yard was quiet enough that I could hear the sweet tea settling in the pitcher. Kevin turned around from the edge of the patio. His face was red at the cheekbones the way faces get when someone has been holding anger in for a while and the container is getting full. Walter sat back down. His part was done. He picked up his thermos and poured the last of his coffee into his mug with the unhurried manner of a man who has said what needed saying and is now prepared to let the rest of it unfold. Daniel reached into the third folder. The young man Ryan was speaking to, Daniel said, was identified by his business card, which he left in Mr. Callahan's mailbox on the morning of the property walk. His name is Chad Ellis. He's a licensed real estate agent with Compass Real Estate here in Franklin. Daniel set a copy of the business card on the table, the same card Walter had handed me on that Saturday morning, now enlarged and printed on white paper. Mr. Ellis was contacted as part of the process of preparing these materials. Ryan went rigid. The back gate opened. It made the same mild creak it always made. Every head at the table turned. Standing at the gate, one hand still on the latch, was a young man in a dark suit, 34 years old, leather portfolio under his arm. His face was flushed and uncomfortable in the way faces get when a person has made a decision that took courage and is now standing on the other side of it, wondering whether the courage was sufficient. Chad Ellis stepped into the backyard. He stopped a few feet inside the gate. He looked at the table. He looked at Ryan. He looked at the copy of his business card sitting on Ruth's picnic table in the September afternoon light, and something in his expression, some last remnant of the ambitious young real estate agent who'd walked this property in June taking notes on his phone, collapsed inward on itself. "I'm sorry," Chad said. His voice was thin and strained, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment and found that the rehearsal hadn't fully prepared him. He wasn't looking at Ryan when he said it. He was looking at Diane. Diane stared at him with red-rimmed eyes and a face that had been through too much in the last 20 minutes to have room for surprise. "Who are you?" Carol asked, though she clearly already understood. "He's the man Ryan hired to value this house," I said. So Ryan would know what he was going to make when he sold it. Chad's jaw tightened. He nodded once, like a man accepting a sentence that was fair even if it was painful. "I pulled the comps," he said. "Ryan asked me to run numbers on the property. I didn't at the time, I didn't know." He stopped, pressed his lips together, tried again. "When I realized that the owner was still living here, that nobody had talked to him, that it wasn't..." He exhaled. "I told Ryan I was out. 2 months ago. I told him I wasn't going to be part of it." Ryan's voice came out sharp and stripped of everything that had made it useful to him all afternoon. "Chad, you don't need to be here. This is a private..." "Ryan." Chad looked at him with the specific weariness of someone who has spent 2 months feeling bad about something and is done with the feeling. "I should have come sooner." Diane pressed both hands against her face. Her shoulders shook once hard, like a sob that got stopped at the throat. Then she dropped her hands and looked at her husband. Really looked at him the way you look at something when you're deciding whether it's what you thought it was. Ryan looked back at her, and in the specific, terrible quality of that look between them, the way his eyes moved from her face to the table to the yard, to anywhere that wasn't her face, I understood that he already knew what she was thinking. He'd known since Daniel walked through the gate. Daniel closed the third folder, set his pen down, folded his hands on the table with the composed, unhurried manner of a man who has said everything that needed saying in this portion of the proceeding, and is prepared to be patient with whatever comes next. The September light was going golden across the backyard. The old oak tree threw its long shadow across the lawn. The picnic table, the one Ruth had walked around 3 times in a furniture barn in Brentwood in 1994 before deciding it was exactly right, held all of it. The folders, the thermos, the sweet tea pitcher, the cream-colored proposal Ryan had brought, the banana pudding Carol hadn't touched, and every Sunday afternoon that had ever happened in this yard. I looked at my daughter's face, and I waited. Chad Ellis stood just inside the back gate with the specific stillness of a man who has made a decision and is living in the first seconds of its consequences. He wasn't looking at Ryan anymore. He was looking at Diane, at her red-rimmed eyes, and her hands pressed flat against her thighs, and the careful, fractured composure of a woman holding herself together by will alone. Something in Chad's expression said he understood more clearly than he'd expected to exactly what his involvement had cost this family. "Mr. Ellis," Daniel said. "Thank you for coming." Chad nodded tightly. He walked to the edge of the patio, not sitting, just standing with his portfolio under his arm, like a man who hasn't decided yet whether he's earned the right to take a chair. 3 months ago, Chad said, Ryan came to me with what he described as a pre-market opportunity, a property on Lewisburg Pike. He said the owner was an elderly relative who was considering a transition to assisted living, and that the family wanted to be prepared when that happened. He paused. He said the owner was aware. Carol looked at the tablecloth and said something under her breath that I chose not to hear clearly. So I ran the comparables, Chad continued. Properties in this neighborhood, this lot size updated or not. The number came in at $920,000 conservative estimate. Ryan was very pleased with that number. Chad's voice had gone flat in the way voices go flat when the speaker is trying to keep emotion out of the facts. He asked me to put together a preliminary listing strategy, timeline staging recommendations, which buyers to approach first. Ryan's chair scraped back another inch. Chad, you agreed to. I know what I agreed to, Chad said, and the flatness in his voice sharpened into something with edges. I also know what I found out afterward. He looked at Ryan directly. You told me the owner knew. He didn't know. He had no idea any of this was happening. Chad set his portfolio on the end of the table, not opening it, just setting it down like he was putting something he'd been carrying in the wrong direction. When I figured that out, I told Ryan I was done. That was 2 months ago. Diane turned to her husband. Her voice when it came was the voice of a woman who has passed through shock and grief and arrived somewhere very still and very clear on the other side. How much do you owe? She asked. Ryan's jaw tightened. Diane, this isn't the time to... Ryan. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. How much? The yard waited. Ryan pressed both palms against the table and looked at the wood grain for a long moment, the way a man looks at something when he's trying to decide how much of the truth he can get away with. Then his shoulders dropped just slightly, just enough, and the performance that had carried him through the afternoon finally gave out entirely. 340,000, he said. Give or take. The number landed on the table beside Daniel's folders, and Ryan's cream-colored proposal, and Walter's thermos, and Carol's untouched banana pudding, and it sat there in the September afternoon light for everyone to look at. Helen exhaled slowly through her nose. Margaret closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them. Kevin turned around from the edge of the patio. His face had gone past red and arrived at something quieter and more serious. He walked back to the table and sat down, and the way he sat, straight, deliberate, said he was staying for the rest of this. Daniel opened the third folder and withdrew a single document, a partial credit record obtained through a civil records request, filed as part of preparing Frank's legal defense. Under Tennessee law, An attorney acting on behalf of a client may request financial records relevant to an ongoing legal matter. Daniel didn't read from it. He simply placed it face up on the table where anyone who wanted to could see it. $340,000. A development investment in Rutherford County that had gone sideways 18 months ago. A repayment deadline of December 31st, 2024. Ryan had needed a $1 million house sold by the end of the year. He had needed it badly enough to stand in his father-in-law's driveway in June and tell a real estate agent that the old man just needed to end up in assisted living. Carol stood up from her chair. She didn't say anything to Ryan. She walked around the end of the table and stood behind my chair and put both hands on my shoulders the way she used to put her hands on my shoulders when we were children, and something had frightened her, and she needed to be near something solid. I reached up and put one hand over hers. Diane looked at her husband across the table. The tears on her face had dried. What was left in her expression wasn't anger. Not exactly, it was the particular stillness of a woman who has just understood the full shape of something and is deciding what to do with that understanding. Ryan looked back at her. And in the specific, terrible honesty of that look, in the way his eyes moved to her face and then away and then back, searching for something he'd relied on before and couldn't find. I understood that he already knew. He'd known since Daniel walked through the gate. Maybe he'd known longer than that. Daniel folded his hands on the table and looked at me. I took a slow breath and stood up. I didn't stand up quickly. My knees took a moment the way they always do. 63 years old, 35 years of welding, and the joints have opinions about sudden movement that they're not shy about sharing. Carol kept her hands on my shoulders until I was fully upright, and then she stepped back and gave me the space. I looked at the picnic table, not at Ryan, not at Daniel or his folders, not at Diane or Walter or Chad Ellis, still standing near the gate. I looked at the table itself, the wood grain weathered silver gray from 30 Tennessee summers, the surface smooth in the places where plates and elbows and coffee cups had worn it down rougher at the edges where the weather had worked on it. The teak oil I'd applied on Tuesday had given it back some of its color, but not all of it. Some color only comes from time. Ruth had walked around this table 3 times in a furniture barn in Brentwood before she decided it was the one. I'd stood there waiting, hands in my pockets, watching her circle it, and finally I'd said, "Ruth, it's a table." And she'd looked at me with that particular look she had, patient, affectionate, and entirely certain that I was missing the point, and said, "Frank, it's where the family happens." I hadn't fully understood what she meant until now. 30 years ago. I said, "Ruth brought this table home in the back of my truck. We set it up in this yard on a Saturday afternoon, and the following Sunday we had the first barbecue. Diane was 6 years old. She ate so much corn on the cob she got sick, and Ruth held her hair back and didn't say a word about it being her own fault for eating 6 ears. I paused. That's the kind of woman she was. Margaret made a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely. Then every Sunday since then, I said, "This table has been here. Through 20 years of Ruth's potato salad and my dry rub. Through Diane's graduation and her first job and the Sunday she brought Ryan home for the first time." And I shook his hand and thought, well, he seems all right. I let that sit for a second. Through Ruth's diagnosis and the Sundays that got quieter after that, and the Sunday we didn't have because she was gone. My throat tightened. I let it. And the Sundays I kept having anyway, because she told me to. Because she said the table was where the family happens, and she wanted the family to keep happening, even after she wasn't in it anymore. The yard was completely quiet. Even the oak tree had stilled. I looked at Diane. She was looking back at me with her mother's eyes wet and wide and full of something that had been building for longer than this afternoon. "Diane," I said. I know you've been caught in the middle of something that wasn't fair to put you in. I know you love your husband. I know you're carrying a baby and a career and a marriage, and you've been trying to hold all of it together for a long time. I kept my voice even, not for Ryan's benefit, but for hers. I'm not asking you to choose anything today. I'm just asking you to know that this table, this Sunday, this family was never about the house. It was never about what it's worth or who gets it or what happens when I'm gone. I looked at her steadily. It was about you sitting across from me and eating food your mother taught me to make, and knowing that whatever else was happening in the world, there was a place that was yours. Diane pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders shook hard, and she didn't try to stop it this time. Carol put her arm around her. I turned to Ryan. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, looking at me with the expression of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. The confidence was gone. The calculation was gone. What was left was something younger and less certain than anything I'd seen from him before. Something that might have been the version of Ryan Porter that existed before the debt and the ambition and the careful performance of a man who always knew what things were worth. I almost felt something for him. Almost. Ryan, I said. I don't hate you. I'm not going to pretend I understand why you thought this was acceptable, because I don't. But I'm 63 years old, and I've lived long enough to know that hating a person costs more than it returns. I picked up the cream-colored proposal folder from the table, the one with the 3 tabbed documents and the Green Hills facility brochure and the managed sale agreement, and I folded it in half. I'm not signing this. I'm not moving to Green Hills. I'm not liquidating anything. I set the folded folder on the table in front of him. This house is where Ruth and I raised our daughter. It's where our grandchild is going to know their grandfather. And it will be here on Sunday afternoons for as long as I am able to stand at that grill and cook. Ryan stared at the folded folder. I took one more breath. But from today, I said, there will not be a seat at this table for you. Nobody moved for a moment. The September light was going long and golden across the yard, the kind of late afternoon light that makes everything it touches look like it's been there forever and will stay forever, even the things that won't. The oak tree threw its shadow across the lawn in a slow diagonal. Somewhere down Lewisburg Pike, a dog was barking at something it would never catch. Ryan looked at the folded folder in front of him. Then he looked at Diane. Diane was looking at her father. She wasn't looking at her husband. She wasn't looking at Daniel's folders or Chad Ellis near the gate or the cream-colored proposal that had come in on a Sunday afternoon with the intention of dismantling 30 years of something real. She was looking at me, and in her expression passed the grief and the exhaustion and the particular devastation of a woman who has just watched a version of her life fall apart in a backyard. There was something else. Recognition. The specific kind that comes when someone says a true thing in words you already knew in your bones. Ryan stood up slowly. He picked up the canvas tote. He picked up the folded proposal folder and put it inside. He straightened his collar in the automatic way men straighten things when they don't know what else to do with their hands. He looked at Diane one more time. His mouth opened slightly like a sentence was forming, and then thought better of itself. Then he walked to the back gate. It made the same creak it always made. And he was gone. Nobody watched him go. That was the thing. Not Carol, not Kevin, not Margaret or Helen or Walter. Nobody turned to mark the exit of the man who had walked into this yard 3 hours ago with a folder full of plans and the assumption that the room would arrange itself around his purposes. Chad Ellis exhaled a long, uneven breath and looked at Daniel. "Is there anything else you need from me?" "I'll be in touch," Daniel said. "Thank you for coming." Chad nodded, once looked briefly at Diane and let himself out the same gate Ryan had used. The creak again, then quiet. Walter reached for the serving tongs. "There's still 2 ribeyes on that platter," he said in the voice of a man raising a practical matter that deserves attention. "It'd be a genuine shame." Carol laughed. It came out surprised, the kind of laugh that arrives before you've decided to allow it, and it was enough to break something open in the yard, some tight-held quality that had been in the air since Ryan had reached into his canvas tote and changed the temperature of the afternoon. Kevin stood up and went to the grill without being asked the way he'd gone to help with the chairs when he'd arrived, because that was the kind of young man he was. He lifted the lid, checked the coals, decided they were fine. Margaret Briley stood up and straightened her dress and walked to the sweet tea pitcher and poured fresh glasses for Helen and Carol, and then for me, setting mine down in front of me with both hands, the way Ruth used to set things down with care, with intention, like the act of placing something meant something. Ruth would have had something to say about all of this, Margaret said. She would have had several things to say, I said. She in a specific order, Helen added, and that got a real laugh from Carol, the kind that remembers. Diane was still in her chair. She hadn't moved since Ryan left. Her hands were in her lap, turned palms up the way hands rest when the body has stopped bracing for something and doesn't quite know what to do with the relief. I walked around the table and sat down beside her. Not in Ruth's chair. In the chair next to it, the one that had always been mine when the table was full, and Ruth was in her spot, and Diane was across from us, and the afternoon was going the way Sunday afternoons were supposed to go. Diane looked at me. Her eyes were dry now. Something had shifted in her face, not settled, not resolved, nothing that simple, but present. Here, in this yard, on this Sunday, at this table. I don't know what I'm going to do, she said. Her voice was quiet and honest, the way voices get when they've stopped performing anything. You don't have to know today, I said. She looked at her hands in her lap. The baby's going to need a grandfather. The baby's going to have one, I said. Every Sunday, right here. She reached over and took my hand. Not dramatically, just took it the way people take hold of things they need to hold on to, and held on. Walter set a plate down in front of me. A ribeye medium with a dark crust from Ruth's dry, rubbed the brown sugar, giving it that particular sweetness that made people close their eyes on the first bite. A baked potato on the side. Corn. Don't let it get cold, Walter said in the tone of a man who has done his part and considers the matter closed. I looked at the plate. Then I looked at the table, at Carol and Kevin and Margaret and Helen, settling back into their chairs, at Daniel, closing his briefcase with 2 quiet clicks, at Walter sitting back down at his end with his thermos and his cap. At Diane beside me, holding my hand, looking at the yard where her mother had spent 30 years building something worth protecting. I picked up my fork. The food was hot. The evening was warm. The oak tree held its ground against the September sky, the same way it had held it for 30 years, through everything. I took the first bite, and it tasted exactly like Sunday was supposed to taste. There's something I've learned from all of this, something I should have understood 30 years earlier, but needed a ruined plate of food and a pool full of car keys to finally see clearly. Kindness is not the same as permission, and keeping the peace is not the same as having it. I spent years telling myself that staying quiet was protecting my family. But silence isn't protection. It's just a slower way of losing. If I could go back and give myself one piece of advice, it would be this: don't do what I did. Don't wait until someone is standing in your driveway pricing your life before you decide it's worth defending. I believe God puts the right people in the right place at the right time. Walter was trimming that hedge for a reason. Daniel picked up that phone call for a reason. And that Sunday afternoon, every person sitting at Ruth's table was there for a reason. This is my grandpastry's moment, the one I'll carry for the rest of my life. Not the confrontation, not the folders or the recordings or Ryan walking out that gate. It's Diane sitting beside me, holding my hand, telling me the baby is going to need a grandfather. That's the only revenge story worth telling. Not the kind that destroys, the kind that rebuilds. If something in this grandpastry's touched you today, leave a comment below, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the end. And one small note, some stories on this channel contain fictional elements created purely for storytelling and reflection. If that's not for you, no hard feelings, choose what serves you best. But if you're staying, we have so much more ahead.